If you were a kid born in the 90s, chances are that you've read one or more entries from R.L. Stine's hauntingly brilliant Goosebumps series. These stories were all over the place, and scared a generation of kids into reading. Over 62 books were published under the original Goosebumps line, and where their success, there are spin-offs, adaptations, and merchandise. However, for this video, we'll be taking a look at the 1995 television adaptation of Goosebumps, and despite having some outdated effects by today's standards, as well as many laughably bad moments, the original Goosebumps TV series had some pretty terrifying episodes. So today, we're going to count down the top 10 best episodes of Goosebumps.
There's something horrible happening in Fever Swamp. Something really horrible.
Based on the 14th book of the original Goosebumps series, The Werewolf of Fever Swamp stars a boy named Grady Tucker and his older sister Emily. They just recently moved to Fever Swamp, Florida, so their scientist parents can study swamp deer. After exploring the swamp, they meet another boy named Will Blake, who tells them the history of Fever Swamp. 100 years ago, almost everyone in the town contracted an illness and died, while those who didn't die went insane. That night, Grady suffers from a fever. The next day, they find a big dog and decide to keep it as a pet. They name it Vandal, although he is named Wolf in the original book. After increasing suspicious activities, including the death of many animals and the disappearance of some townsfolk, Will accuses Vandal of being a werewolf. And after the death of one of his swamp deer, Grady's father begins to believe this as well, and he even campaigns to have the dog put to sleep. Grady releases Vandal before this could happen, and goes out with Will later that night to search for him. Grady soon discovers that Will is the true werewolf, who proceeds to bite him. He wakes up the next morning back home, brought by the local swamp hermit. His father tells him that the hermit saw Vandal save his life, thus letting him keep the dog. The episode ends with Grady walking outside and howling at the moon, implying that the werewolf of Fever Swamp is now him, and in the book it outright confirms this, with an epilogue stating that him and Vandal go out exploring on full moons together. A bit of a happy ending, I suppose.
Obsessed with worms. That's putting it mildly.
Based on the 21st book, Go Eat Worms, stars Todd Barstow, a worm fanatic. He loves collecting and tormenting his sister with them. Him and his friend Danny are always out collecting worms in the rain together. As the school science fair rolls around, Todd's thoughts go immediately to his worms and which way he can enter them as a project. However, he learns that a rich kid named Patrick is also planning on entering a worm-related project. At night, him and Danny go to Patrick's house to discover what kind of project he's working on, but are attacked by an evil spirit dog. They briefly manage to see a corpse inside the house and are frightened away. The next day, he learns it was a prank pulled by his sister and gets revenge by sabotaging her science fair project. After losing the science fair to Patrick, Todd and Danny go back to hunting worms. After a successful hunt one day, he goes to the basement to show his sister and her friend a cool trick, where he slices a worm in half. The worms he keeps in his aquarium see this, however, and they are not pleased. Todd soon begins to find worms in his hat, bed, food, and homework. He goes downstairs to apologize to the worms, before he's confronted with his father holding a baseball bat, who tells him to get rid of the worms. After learning that this was another prank by his sister, Todd goes to dig up more worms for revenge, but is suddenly pulled underground by a giant worm. The final confrontation takes place in an enormous cavern filled with worms. Danny and Todd's sister are able to scare the big worm away to save Todd, who gives up on his worm hobby for good. The ending to the book and episode are very different. In the episode, Todd turns to fishing to replace his worm hobby, but is pulled underwater by a giant fish, leading him to give up fishing. In the book, however, Todd takes up butterfly collecting. He wakes up in the middle of the night to find an enormous butterfly standing over him, holding a large silver pin, seeking revenge. The implications of the book are much, much more horrifying.
Practice till you drop. Dead.
The 13th book of the series, Piano Lessons Can Be Murder, was adapted onto television December 8th, 1995. The story follows Jerry, whose family moved into a new house. He discovers a dusty old piano in the attic, which he hears playing music quietly at night. He decides to investigate one night and finds a ghost girl. She looks at him, and her face melts off, leaving behind just a skull. Well, at least in the book. She just kinda tells him to get lost in the episode. Jerry's parents decide to sign him up for piano lessons with a man named Dr. Shriek, who seems to be particularly interested in Jerry's hands. While at his lessons, he sees a terrifying robot in the halls, which, in actuality, is just a floor sweeper made by the maintenance man, Mr. Toggle. There's another scary scene present only in the book, where Jerry confronts the ghost downstairs again, only to find that she has bloody stumps where her hands used to be. Jerry learns more about this the next day at his lessons, where he discovers that all the other students are actually disembodied hands playing the piano. Dr. Shriek attacks him, but he's saved by Mr. Toggle, who turns off Shriek with a remote. It turns out, though, that Dr. Shriek was actually created by Mr. Toggle, who is the true mastermind. He needs hands to play music for him because it's just too difficult to build robot hands.
You want Dr. Shriek?
I need your hands, Jerry.
You're nuts! Why do you need my hands?
To make beautiful music.
In the end, Jerry is saved by the ghost, who turns out to be Mr. Toggle's strict old piano teacher. He goes on his merry way to live a life of normal mediocrity, while Toggle is forced to practice piano for all eternity. In the book, the ghost never specifically is named or given a backstory to. In the original climax, Jerry is actually saved by a swarm of ghosts with bloody stumps, who all lost their hands to Mr. Toggle. They drag him off into the forest, never to be seen again. The TV episode's ending is a bit more silly, whereas the book's ending is much more frightening and dark.
There's something weird about the rides at Horrorland. Something a little too creepy. A little too real.
One of the more iconic books in the series, One Day at Horrorland, spawned quite a bit of spin-off material, including a video game, board game, and an entire sub-series of books with an overarching plot. The television adaptation was a 2-part episode, with the release of each part spaced out between a week. The story begins with the Morris family driving through the desert looking for the Zoo Gardens theme park. They come across a forest with a spooky theme park called Horrorland and decide to check it out. Despite being completely run down with a few abandoned cars in the parking lot, the dad thinks it'll be a great idea to spend some time there. First things first, one of the monsters, called Horrors in this story, places a weird beeping device on their car after they park. At the ticket booth, they are greeted with a vendor in a lifelike costume who allows them to enter the park for free. After splitting from their parents, the two children are warned by another horror to escape while they still can.
Get out! While you still can!
You scared him. That wasn't very nice.
You shouldn't be here! It's not safe! Get out! Get out!
Wait!
They swiftly ignore him and go to the House of Mirrors, where they get lost and attacked by a horror. They continue riding terrifying rides before they get the idea that Horrorland might be dangerous. Upon trying to leave, however, they find themselves locked in. They're captured by the horrors and thrown into a game show where they must fight for their life not to be eaten. Luckily, they are saved by the horror who warned them before. After they escape, they find that their car is out of their control and is driven off the edge of a cliff. The Morris family's fate is unclear as a couple of elderly horrors turn off their TV, exclaiming that human shows are just too scary. As is tradition, there are a few differences from the book, such as the ending itself. They aren't saved by horror, but rather one of the kids remembers a sign she saw that said no pinching the monsters. She does so, and it deflates and dies. They escape and steal a bus, finally getting to go home. Little did they know, however, our horror clung to the back of the bus and gives them free passes for next year. It's a bit up in the air on which ending is more scary. Either way, the thought of a haunted amusement park where the rides try to kill you certainly is unsettling, even if it does take place in broad daylight in the show.
Every picture tells a story.
Say Cheese and Die was the fourth book in the Goosebumps series, adapted for television on February 9th, 1996. It stars a young Ryan Gosling as the main character Greg early on in his career. The story starts with Greg and his three friends exploring a creepy old house where a spider-like man named Spidey lives. While inside the house, they find a strange camera. Greg takes a picture of one of his friends, and immediately after, the railing he was leaning on breaks and falls. Luckily, he comes out with just a few bruises, but the children don't have much of a clue on how it happened. As time goes on, Greg takes more and more pictures, but each picture turns out wrong. A picture of his father's new car shows it completely wrecked. A picture of his brother in his room instead shows him in front of an unknown house looking upset. Greg becomes convinced that the camera is cursed, but another one of his friends doesn't believe him and asks him to take her picture. He reluctantly does, and soon after he takes it, she goes missing.
Greg Banks?
Yeah.
Do you know Sherry Walker?
Sherry? Yeah, she's one of my best friends.
When was the last time you saw her?
Earlier today at her house.
Do you know where she is now?
At her house, I guess.
No, she's not. She's missing. Disappeared.
After days of her missing, he rips up the picture, causing her to return with no memory of what actually happened. They decide to return the camera to Spidey's home so it cannot hurt anyone else. While returning it, they run into Spidey, who reveals himself to be the creator of the camera. His assistant was unhappy with Spidey taking all the credit though, so he cursed the camera to make horrifying events come true, as well as be completely indestructible. Not wanting the camera's secrets to get out to the world, Spidey decides to imprison Greg and his friends. The ending once again is different in the show and in the book. The pictures taken during the struggle between Spidey and Greg, showing Spidey dying of fright, which of course happens soon after. However, in the show, Spidey becomes trapped in the camera until two other boys discover it and later on release him. The show also has no mention of Spidey's assistant, leaving it unknown how the camera became cursed.
It's going to be a long night.
A Night in Terror Tower takes place in London, where Sue and her brother Eddie are visiting. While there, they tour the infamous Terror Tower, where a tour guide shows them all the jail cells and torture chambers. During the tour, Sue notices a man in black following them. They are then told the story of Prince Edward and Princess Suzanne of York, two royals who were sentenced to death by the king.
Imagine 2 children dragged away from their home, locked away in the drab chill of this cell at the top of a tower.
What happened to them?
The Lord High Executioner's men crept up the stairs. Their orders? To kill the 2 children, to keep the prince and the princess from ever taking the throne.
They realize Latour left them behind, and the man in black attempts to capture them. They manage to escape, and a night guard calls them a cab to take them to their hotel. Strange things begin to happen once they get to the hotel, though. They realize that the money their parents gave them is worthless, as well as discovering that no family had registered the hotel room that they were staying in. When questioned, the two can't seem to even remember their last name. They run from the hotel, but are stopped by the man in black. It turns out, Eddie had stolen 3 white gems from him back at the tower. Using the gems, the man in black sends them back in time to medieval London. Sue and Eddie are locked in a castle by the man in black, who is revealed as the Lord High Executioner. They are then greeted by a sorcerer named Morgred, who tells the children that they are actually Prince Edward and Princess Susanna from the story.
You are not Eddie and Sue. What? You are Edward and Susanna, the Prince and Princess of York.
Using the white gems, he cast them into a future with false memories, so they would not be killed by their uncle, the king. Eddie steals the gems, and uses them to cast them back into the present, along with Morgred. The book has a happier ending, where the 3 of them live happily ever after in the present. In the show, however, the Lord High Executioner manages to travel back to the present with them, leaving their fates unclear. This was a 2-part episode, and is one of 3 episodes in the series to have a unique credits theme, this one being medieval themed. It also features R.L. Stine himself as the host of the episode.
Something's waiting in the dark.
Stay Out of the Basement is the 2nd book of the original Goosebumps series, and follows Margaret and Casey Brewer, as well as their father who recently lost his job as a botanist at a nearby university. Ever since he got fired, he's been spending all of his time in the basement, working on something.
I know, it's just that I'm worried about Dad. He's been acting so weird lately.
He's under a lot of pressure, Margaret.
But he never has time for me anymore. He's even stopped calling me Princess.
I thought you hated that.
I do, but it just seems like he's changed.
Their mother leaves on a trip to visit their aunt in the hospital, leaving them all alone with their father. When their father isn't home, they decide to investigate the basement and find it covered with huge jungle-like plants and an intense humidity. They even find that some of the plants are breathing in a very human-like fashion. Their father finds them in the basement and angrily tells them to stay out until the day comes when he shows them what is down there. Things get progressively more and more strange when Margaret finds her father eating plant food. Under his hat, he now has green leaves growing out, and he bleeds bright green blood. His bed had changed too, now being covered with moist dirt and worms. Their father calls him down for lunch, which appears to be green mashed potatoes. He attempts to force them to eat it, but lucky for them, the doorbell rings. They quickly throw their food in the trash and find Dr. Merrick at the door, their father's old boss. They realize that after their father and him go to check out the basement, Dr. Merrick never left. When their father isn't around again, they investigate the basement and find Dr. Merrick's clothes, as well as increasingly humanoid-looking plant creatures. They also find their father tied up, who reveals that the man they thought was their father was actually a plant doppelganger. The plant father shows up and the two fight. Each one of them tries to convince the children that they are the real father.
Princess! Princess!
But the previously tied up one wins out by calling Margaret Princess, his old nickname for her. They axe the plant man until he is no more. Their father decides to give up on his experiments for good and buries what little he had left in the backyard. All seems well now until a small plant begins to bother Margaret by claiming that it's her real father. Then tons of small plants exclaim the same thing. This is definitely one of the more faithful adaptations, with the only changes being very minor ones that didn't really have any effect on the plot. The ending is left almost exactly the same, which is great because it was already a very unsettling ending. Could the plants be lying? It's possible, but we don't know what kind of things they're capable of. Perhaps their real father is no more and they're just doomed to be tricked by these plants, over and over.
Look alive.
Welcome to Dead House is the very first book in the original Goosebumps series, and the 39th episode of the TV series. This episode focuses on a brother and sister named Josh and Amanda. The family just moved into a town named Dark Falls, which seems very, well, dark. Despite it being July, the trees are brown and dead. The house they just moved into is no different, full of creaky floorboards and bleak walls, the whole shebang. Not to mention ghosts appearing and disappearing in their house. After many more appearances of ghost children in the house, and their dog Petey going haywire, Amanda learns that all of the ghost children were murdered while they lived in that house, and that once a year, they require blood of a freshly killed person to sustain their living dead existence for another year. Amanda is attacked by the ghost of the children in the graveyard, but is saved by Josh at the last moment. He shines light on the ghost, turning it into nothing more than a pile of bones. The ghost children reveal that the letter that invited them to Dark Falls, the one that said they inherited the house from their great dead uncle, was false, and nothing more than a trick. A trick conceived by Mr. Dawes, their real estate agent, who is also dead. As this is the very first book in the series, the plot is a bit simpler compared to later, but this doesn't make it any less freaky. An entire town full of ravenous ghost zombies is nightmare fuel incarnate, and the show delivers on that end. The ending of the book has them abandoning the house and moving out, only to see another family is moving in, led by none other than Mr. Dawes. The show, however, has them driving away from the horde of zombie townsfolk, with Mr. Dawes begging them to stay. They pick up their dog on the way, but find that he has been bitten and turned undead. The family's fate is left uncertain.
He's still walking. He's still stalking.
Night of the Living Dummy 2, as one would expect, is a sequel to the original book. Many people mistakenly believe that Slappy the Dummy was the main antagonist in the first book, but this is actually the first time he appears as a main antagonist, cementing his role in almost all future books. Strangely, the first Night of the Living Dummy was never adapted for the TV show, with the sequel instead being the first appearance of Slappy on screen. The story follows a girl named Amy Kramer, who practices ventriloquism with her dummy, Dennis. Unfortunately, the dummy is falling apart, so her parents buy her a new one at the pawn shop, Slappy. Inside his pocket, Amy finds a little card with some strange words on it. After saying these words aloud, Slappy begins to act on his own accord and do mischievous things.
What the? Amy!
Of course, she gets blamed for all this, although her sister Sarah believes her. The girls decide to prove to their parents that Slappy is alive, with their younger brother disguising himself as Dennis to shock Slappy long enough for them to grab him. Dennis startles Slappy enough for him to fall backwards, breaking his head in two. When the light comes on, they see that their little brother was actually asleep the whole time, and Dennis had come to life on his own to stop Slappy.
It's good to be back in the family again.
While he is relatively harmless in the story, Slappy is still very frightening due to his appearance and demeanor. The prop used for him in the show is particularly unnerving. No matter how they appear, dummies always just seem to be freaky.
A quick honorable mention goes out to the horror at Camp Jilly Jam. This book was never adapted into an episode for the TV show, but it still remains one of the more frightening stories. It features two siblings at a summer camp called King Jilly Jam's Sports Camp, and there, the children compete in sports to collect 6 king coins. Doing so will allow them to join a ceremony called the Winner's Walk, where they are never seen again afterwards. The sister soon discovers that this is more of a cult, with the counselor striving to serve the master, the titular King Jelly Jam. It turns out the children that win are chosen to be slaves for the king, and if you fail, you are eaten by him. It's a really disturbing and terrifying premise, to be sure. Maybe it was never adapted because it would be kind of expensive. I mean, King Jelly Jam would require a really elaborate prop to portray him properly.
If looks could kill.
At last, we made it to our final entry on the list, and it's one of the most iconic Goosebumps stories, The Haunted Mask. Split into a two-part episode, the story follows Carly Beth Caldwell, who is getting ready for Halloween. Annoyed at being called a scaredy cat and being treated like a baby, she vows to wear a costume that will really scare people this year. She disregards the cutesy costume that her mother made for her, and instead goes to a costume shop that just recently opened. Inside, she finds that it's filled with some of the most hideous and deformed masks she has ever seen, including a disgusting, monstrous green mask, which she decides to purchase. She manages to scare her brother with the mask, although it does alter her voice a little bit, making it a hoarse growl unintentionally. It takes a bit of pulling to get the mask off, but she's sure she made the perfect purchase. She puts the mask back on and goes off to get payback on her friends who scare her daily. But she begins to act differently. She attacks people, terrorizing children, and vandalizes the neighborhood. She soon finds out that the mask has fused with her face and will not come off. She tries to return it, but the shopkeeper tells her that it will not come off, as it is a real living face, belonging to a group called the Unloved Ones. The only way it can be removed is with a true symbol of love. The other masks on the wall come alive and begin to chase Carly as she runs and tears down the streets. She then realizes the costume her mother made her is a true symbol of love, and uses it to deter the masks and remove the one from her face. Safe at last, she runs into her mother's embrace, while her younger brother picks up the mask and decides to put it on, and of course, he can't get it off. The Haunted Mask is definitely one of the most scariest books and episodes of the entire series. The concept of a mask slowly eating away your face while your muffled screams can barely get through is just bone-chilling. R.L. Stine himself has said it's the book he's most proud of, and it's his favorite in the series. And he should be very proud of it, because it fulfilled its purpose. It gave nightmares to an entire generation of children for years, including my scriptwriter. Congrats, Stine.